Coming up in this week's episode of the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy...
Our listeners can go to hell. That's always been my official position.
Oh, hold up. There's someone at the door. I'll be back.
What, as far as you know, is my own urine?
Worse than a fish?
Tell me about mustard gas.
Oh,
God, Grandma's on about the tunnels again. Somebody get a medicine. Jesus Christ. Plus, Im updates us on their most recent work.
I call upon thee, Satan, to curse reviewer B. Tano Koro Shira Pariandos.
But now, the theme music. The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, brought to you today by Josh Edison and M. Dentith. Hello and welcome to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. In Auckland, New Zealand, I am Josh Edison, and in Guangzhou, China, they are Dr. M. Dentith. It's part three of a book review. There will not be a part 4. I'm saying that now. If we're taking too long, I'm just going to skip right to the end.
I've pulled out surprises in the past. Who knows what surprise I might pull out at the end of this episode?
Whatever, it won't be enough. If you try to stick a fourth episode of this on, there will be violence somehow. I know we're in different hemispheres of the planet right now, but I'll think of something.
Well, and I mean, I might be in the same hemisphere as you. Oh,
that's right, you might. Yeah.
July or August. It's not official yet in the sense that I haven't seen plane tickets, but it's pretty much official. I'm spending half of July, the latter half, and the first half of August, because they connect. That's how calendars work. The end of July merges with the beginning of August to form a kind of unified timeline. But I'm going to be down in Otago, in Dunedin of Aotearoa, New Zealand, spending a month as a visiting fellow at the University of Otago, which means that Charles Pigden and I will be hanging out. And at this stage, I'll be helping him co-teach a class on conspiracy theories. So it's all rather exciting. And it does mean that come the end of August, or at least as we're approaching the end of August, I'm likely to pop up to Auckland for a few days, and then Josh can slap me with a fish, as is his wont.
Yes, yeah, obviously I was going to do that anyway, but if you try to chuck some more of this material at me, I'll slap you with something worse than a fish. 2 fish.
Worse than a fish? I mean, no one's ever contemplated something worse than a fish before. This 2 fish gambit, it's going somewhere.
But that's for the future, and it's not the future, it's now. Funny how that works out. And now, we are once again going to talk about the book Tunnel Vision by Martin Butler in all its various guises and editions, just as soon as one of us plays a chime. Right, so where were we? We were talking about the book Tunnel Vision, editions 1, 2, and 2.5/3 by Martin Butler, who thinks there are hidden tunnels underneath North Head, the military base in North Head and Devonport in Auckland in New Zealand. He thinks inside these hidden tunnels there may be relics of New Zealand's early aviation history in the form of a couple of disassembled Boeing aircraft, and also thinks there might be unexploded ammunition sealed away there by the Army for reasons unknown. He has previously gone over the history of aviation in New Zealand, the history of the military base at North Head. He's gone over the history of investigations looking for hidden tunnels in North Head. He's gone over the court case that resulted from one of these investigations and the investigation by the Department of Conservation that came out of that court case. He's gone through all of that. He's gone through a whole bunch of different witness statements that came up during that investigation, which we spent a fair amount of time having a look at last week. And finally, having exhausted last episode, and finally having exhausted all other avenues, he's basically gone back to doing his own research. Now, where we are in my copy of the book is up to chapter 9, But I believe in between what my one calls Chapter 9 and what we just looked at, you have a couple of extra chapters in your magical later editions.
Yes, so last episode we looked at my chapter 9, which is the additional episodes chapter, the additional evidence chapter, which is actually your chapter 10. So basically, when we get to your chapter 10, we actually covered it in my chapter 10, because my chapter 10 is an expanded version of your chapter 10, which makes it very confusing, because we are still stuck all the way back in my chapter 10, which comes before your chapter 9. Now, are you following me, or do you need a chart of some kind?
I'm following you because I have a physical copy of this book directly next to me that I've spent a fair bit of time looking at.
Listeners may be very confused.
Our listeners can go to hell. That's so always been my official position.
Doesn't really exist in the earlier edition, so in the first edition. It's in editions 2 and 3, because as discussed in the first episode of this series, editions 2 and 3 are basically identical right down to the pagination, except for the existence of a mysterious section at the end called 16, which I'm fairly sure is meant to be chapter 16, but isn't called a chapter, and is also written in a way that doesn't really feel like a chapter. It feels like an appendix of some kind. But here we are in editions 2 and 3, in chapter 10, subtitle World War II, which is obviously the sequel to World War One.
That was, yes. Bigger budget, as I recall. And actually,
one of those few cases where the villain in the sequel really outclasses the villain in the prequel.
Yes, no, they did well for themselves. So I assume this isn't talking about...
Having made light of both the First World War and the Second World War, let's talk about the role of North Head in that conflict.
Yeah, I assume... Like World War II was not fought in New Zealand at any point, although, of course, our soldiers even fought overseas. So what was happening then back in Devonport during World War II?
Well, this is where Butler thinks there's a mystery, because he finds that the official opinions of North Head differ depending on their sources when it comes to the role of that fort during the Second World War. Now, he takes it's a mystery. I think he's kind of overstating things, because he's taking to be what he takes to be official opinions are in some cases simply the way that people have told their own versions of the history of the fort on North Head during the Second World War. So he takes it that the Historic Places Trust, which looks after historic places in New Zealand, and I don't believe is a governmental entity. It's a non-governmental organization that basically plays a role in preserving the history of historic places in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but acts independently of the government. Their view on North Head basically can be summarized as North Head is the best. They talk about the importance of North Head during World War II. Now, the Department of Conservation, which of course did all of the archaeological investigations into North Head and actually collated a lot of previously undiscovered, or at least not really comprehensively understood historical material about North Head, when they talk about North Head, they go, well, look, North Head was okay. It was an important administrative centre during World War II. It played its part in the organisation of a potential defence of the country had the war ever got to this particular part of the South Pacific. But it wasn't the biggest and the best fort in the world. It was a fort built cheaply and had a surprising number of limitations given the role it was going to eventually play. And his third official opinion is the judgment of Justice Sean Elias, who, of course, was the person who went through and was the judge in the court case between John Earnshaw and the Crown about the aborted military investigation of North Head that occurred before the Department of Conservation investigation. And in the judgment of Justice Elias, North Head was basically just an administrative centre during World War II, and not much else. So you have the Historic Places Trust who go, look, North Head is great. The Department of Conservation going, well, North Head's pretty okay. And then Justice Elias going, well, North Head, it was nothing special. And he takes it that these are official opinions, and given that they are official opinions and they're in contention with one another, then that means that someone is trying to skew the history of North Head, and thus, in that skewing, possibly cloud or occlude exactly what was happening at North Head at that time.
Right, so we're just doing the thing again, are we, of pointing out inconsistencies as though to suggest something weird is going on or something has been covered up, but he doesn't sound like he's actually offering much evidence of anything much at this point.
I mean, but he does bring another argument to bear here, and this is actually quite an interesting argument. So the first half of the chapter, which is 17 pages in length, is a potted overview of the role that North Head played in World War II. So it talks about the different commanders that were there, the different jurisdictions those commanders had. And this leads to Butler making the claim that, look, what we can see on North Head, and that's what we can see now, including what we could see on North Head from the official photos of the time, means that the facilities that were visible and people were able to describe as part of the official record don't appear to be up to the tasks required for the different commanders who were doing their jobs on North Head at the time. So he goes, it's just inconceivable that a command structure that's been used for one element of command, which was quite small, would be shared by an additional commander, let alone a third. So look, there aren't enough structures to fit the number of people doing the kind of jobs they're meant to do. And then he goes, and here's my smoking gun. We have official manuals that were produced by the War Office at the time, which describes how facilities should be built, and North Head doesn't match the kind of facility that should have been built if people were building a facility according to the official regulations.
So again, that doesn't sound like a lot to go on. Simply, we have this manual, and what's at North Head doesn't look like what they say to do in the manual. But I mean, does that mean anything? Is it inconceivable that people wouldn't have followed the instructions in this manual?
Well, if you recall, going all the way back to our first episode, Butler finds it inconceivable that people wouldn't follow the chain of command. So when he talks about things being burnt or things being destroyed on beaches, he goes, well, it's inconceivable that a lieutenant like Salt would do something without getting written permission from his superiors. And the fact there is no evidence of that permission indicates that Salt couldn't have done the thing that he said to have done. And so he's applying the same kind of argument here, which is if the manual says you build a fort in this particular way, then you build that fort in that particular way. Let me give you a quote. So here he's talking about the situation on North Head. According to the experts, the 9th Heavy Coast Regiment headquarters was located above ground and without any supporting infrastructure or a dedicated communications facility. This situation was contrary to the accepted military practice during World War II and unbelievable when considering the strategic importance of North Head. Wherever possible, New Zealand complied with the structures and configuration of defence as outlined in the manuals of the British Commonwealth. These documents describe the requirements for coastal fortification against attack. It is noteworthy that the requirement for the fortress plotting room was as follows. The building will normally be underground, will be supplied with filtered air as a protection against gas, and will be proof against 16-inch shell attack or the equivalent.
Right, so normally underground.
But the other thing which sticks out, which is wherever possible.
Yes, that does seem to be doing a bit of work there.
Yes, and herein lies the issue. One thing which doesn't get discussed in this book at all is the fact that the fort on North Head was built on the cheap. I mean, we know quite a lot about the building of the fort, the architect of the fort, and the processes by which the building materials were brought to Devonport and then used to build the fort. So we know that it wasn't a particularly expensive fortification. The reason why they did cut and cover, as opposed to digging tunnels into the welded scoria of Monuika, is for the sheer fact that they were trying to build the fort as cheaply as possible. And this isn't discussed here. So Butler is just ignoring the fact that there is historical discussion about why this fort doesn't fit the requirements at the time.
Yeah, I suppose it could make sense that things weren't done as scrupulously as possible all the way over on the other side of the planet.
End of the Commonwealth. Yeah, I mean, for us, it's an important country, and for the indigenous people, of course, very important. But to the British, we were the arse end of the world. I mean, we've talked about the Kaskawhisky incident on this podcast before. And for listeners who aren't aware of this, a hoax story which appeared in a Auckland newspaper at the end of the 19th century, where it was implied that a Russian ironclad had sailed into the Waitemata, the harbour in the centre of Auckland, and held the Auckland Council to ransom. This hoax story was basically written to show to the people of Auckland that the City Council didn't have their best interests at heart, but also was written to point out that if such an event was ever to occur, there was no defence to come from the United Kingdom, which was in charge of the country at the time, because there was no British naval presence in the South Pacific at that time. The British ordered the New Zealand government to fortify the country in the build-up to the Prussian scare, World War I and World War II. But they weren't particularly interested in doing anything to ensure that we fortified properly. And we've always been a low-income economy since year dot, basically, compared to our supposed neighbours in the north.
Yes, a fact that he doesn't seem to consider. Okay, so where does he go from there?
Well, without citing sources, he estimates that around about 300 people worked at the fort. So he just keeps on adding in things to go, the structures on North Head don't match how North Head should have been provided for as an active military fort. So he goes, look, he estimates 300 people worked at the fort. He doesn't cite his sources here, so it's just a number which appears. And he goes, about 140 of those were working on defensive equipment. And he goes, well, look, if there are 300 people working at the fort, there's not enough cover or protection for all of them if the surface structures are where they're meant to take cover in terms of an attack. So once again, that is very suggestive that maybe, not maybe, there must have been other structures for these people to be able to go into should the fort come into attack. So his entire argument basically is North Head doesn't follow the manual for a command center. It doesn't have enough facilities for the number of people estimated to have worked there, and thus it is inconceivable that the structures on North Head as we know them today, and according to the photographic record we have, is sufficient for the role North Head played in World War II.
Okay, and are we just supposed to infer from that because there don't seem to be enough above-ground structures, that means there must have been a whole bunch more underground that we don't know about? Is that where he's going?
Well, so because we're now talking about a version of the book which is kind of ducking and diving away from the version of the book that you have read, he does bring up the ammunition stuff in this chapter. Because his other argument here is that, look, North Head would have been an ideal underground ammunition depot. Now, some of his arguments here aren't bad. There is some weird / missing history with respect to what ammunition depots we had during World War II and where the ammunition was kept. So there's a kind of lacuna here as to exactly how many depots were in action, where were they located, etc., etc. Which once again I think speaks to the fact that there's some really bad record keeping by the military here, which Butler seems to find inconceivable when it comes to North Head related stuff, but is willing to accept when it comes to non-North Head related military records. And he also points out it would make sense to have separate facilities for ammunition storage just for redundancy's sake. You don't want to keep all your ammunition in one particular location because if that gets shelled, that's a really, really bad situation. So you want to have more than one depot. But this all seems like an argument which is designed to make sense of the eyewitness testimony he's already provided, rather than an argument that works to kind of give independent reason for believing the eyewitness testimony to be true. So because the eyewitnesses talk about ammunition being inside the head, he needs to find an argument to show, well, look, there's a reason why it would be there, as opposed to finding an independent reason to go, oh, this by chance also supports the eyewitness testimony.
Right. Is that it then? Is it just a little... No,
there's two minor points that need to be talked about. The first is one of those things where, as I said, he's happy for military history to be incomplete in non-North Head cases, but is very concerned about incomplete military history in the North Head case. So he's really fixated on the idea that records have been destroyed or not kept, or possibly in some cases, records were never made in the first place. There's no discussion as to whether this is weird or not, which is to say, there's no discussion about whether the military history of North Head being incomplete is somehow different for other fortifications in Aotearoa, New Zealand at the time. Because if it turns out the North Head case is unique, that everywhere else has a complete historical record with no gaps, then the North Head case looks weird. But if the North Head case is kind of consistent with other military fortifications in Aotearoa at the same time, then maybe it's not as unusual as Butler wants to make it out. And if that's the case, then his insistence on people should be following the chain of command, they should be following the official manual, also begins to kind of collapse there. So that's one point, I think, that he kind of doesn't realize he's kind of accidentally making here. The other point is that, as we saw in previous chapters, he makes a really big thing about the idea there's a period of time before World War II where convicts could have built a tunnel structure inside North Head. In this chapter, he talks about how the US forces arrive in Auckland after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and how they have mining expertise. So in this chapter, he now seems to think that it's miners in 1939 who are building the tunnel structure, as opposed to the convicts he heavily suggested were responsible for building the hidden tunnel complex in earlier chapters. So he seems to want to have it both ways. The convicts built it, and if they didn't build it, the mining expertise that arose in 1939 with American troops being on the ground here, that gives them the expertise to build this tunnel structure instead.
Right, so just coming up with a bunch of possibilities, which seems to have been the theme a little bit all the way through. It's always been, it's possible that this could have happened, or it's possible that it might have gone down like this.
Nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more.
So we then go on to what is my chapter 9, what I assume is your chapter 11, Return to the Torpedo Yard. Is that how it goes for you?
I mean, yeah, kind of.
Sort of.
It gets very confusing at this point, because we'll be going back to chapter 10
chapter
or
something.
12.
Let's just say
yeah.
the next chapter, whatever it is. So the next chapter for me is Return to the Torpedo Yard. And this does cover some of the stuff that you've already talked about in these extra ones. So we can skip over some of it quickly. But basically, at this point in the first book, he said there's been all these investigations that haven't found any hidden tunnels at North Head. And Butler still has his doubts that maybe these investigations didn't quite do things properly. But he says there haven't really been investigations of Torpedo Yard. So maybe there would be you could find an entrance to these tunnels there. This was the chapter where I noticed him starting to become like overtly conspiratorial. He's talked about the idea that maybe stuff has been covered up here in the past, but here he really does start saying things like, if a tunnel system does exist under North Head, the witnesses say that the physical evidence was obliterated in the 1970s, and by inference, the camouflaging of the entry points was conducted in such a thorough manner that no evidence remains today. However, no cover-up can be that thorough. And a little bit later, in fact, he also says the fact that there have been 5 investigations that failed to find a single tunnel entrance also signifies that either they do not exist or there has been a conspiracy to hide them. This idea of camouflaging the entry points is quite... He just kind of drops the word in, really, but the idea that not only did they close up these tunnels, they didn't brick them up or block the entrances, but that they then somehow reconstructed them so as to make them look like natural rock face instead of being something, to make it look like there was never a tunnel there in the first place. That's quite an elaborate thing to do, and, of course, a very deliberate thing you'd want to do if you were hiding a secret, basically.
And yet, several of the eyewitness statements we saw in that earlier chapter kind of ridicule this idea. But look, we could even see a case where there are train tracks running into a wall. So on one hand, he wants to go, well, look, they're quite good at hiding the entrances to these tunnels. On the other hand, they seem to have done a really slapdash job of at least one obvious prospective tunnel entrance on North Head. Once again, trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, it gets a bit more confusing later too. I mean, the next bit in this chapter is stuff that we've already spoken about, where he talks about how there could have been... There was this time in history when it was possible to use this convict labour force to have built
that time in history, Josh, being 1888 to 1914.
Yes, which is, if you recall, it directly contradicts what Judge Elias found in the ruling, where there was the bit that there was never a point when there was both an available labour force and a need for more works. Although I guess you could round that by saying no official need for more works, but there was a secret need.
It's a hidden tunnel complex. You want to tell the public about your hidden tunnel complex.
So he goes to that, which you've already talked about. He goes about the sewer tunnel that you mentioned last episode as being the fact that the sewer tunnel exists going underneath North Head and was built around that time shows that there was at least the expertise, or if you're going to say it was impossible to have done a tunnel like that at this time, you can say, well, no, it was possible because they did the sewer tunnel, even though it isn't evidence that there were any other ones. Again, he suggests that a lack of archival records around from around this time means that there was a documentation at one point, but it quote-unquote went missing. But then he talks about these, gets at more witness accounts, looks at these statements about tunnels going from Torpedo Bay up into North Head. And according to the witness statements, he talks that there were 2 entrances, one from a cavern and one from the Torpedo Bay depot. One of these witness statements, again, talks about the idea that this tunnel entrance from a cavern has since been blocked off and camouflaged so that it now looks like an ordinary cliff face. I don't even know how you do that. Well,
I mean, Josh, if I were doing it, I would concrete over the tunnel entrance and then cause a small explosion to cause the cliff face to kind of collapse over the top. You've seen enough action film. It happens all the time.
I suppose. Anyway, so he says the other entrance is supposedly where the carpenter's shop building is now, suggesting that building is hiding the entrance. And he says that the 1980 investigation that looked around here didn't look at this particular wall. So again, there's room for stuff to go on. He talks about a report from 1988, which mentioned a quote-unquote cavern, and that this cavern wasn't mentioned in the doc report in 1992 to 1994, which did not make any sense to me at all. If he wants to that's implying that there was a cavern in 1988 and that wasn't then there in 1992, suggesting that some sort of cover-up had happened between those points, but the cover-up was meant to have happened back in the 1970s. So he kind of lost me a little bit there. He's just sort of pointing out discrepancies again. This thing said a thing is here, and then this other thing said it wasn't, but doesn't. He thinks he's found a contradiction, but even if it's true, it doesn't seem to make sense.
So, to my mind, the tunnel at Torpedo Bay, or Torpedo Yard, the military installation at Torpedo Bay, is the most plausible part of the story here, in that there does seem to be quite a lot of independent witness statements from serving military personnel saying, look, there was a tunnel or cavern cut into the hill or available, or it may have been a natural cavern that was that was accessible to the people at Torpedo Yard, which doesn't appear to be there now. And it might be one of those things which has been lost with time. Maybe it was bricked up. Maybe it collapsed and it was kind of landscaped to make the hillside look nice again. But he can't help himself because this cavern is described in multiple ways. He kind of replicates it. He takes different descriptions to indicate that it must be two caverns, not one. When the more plausible interpretation is, well, there was a cavern in the hillside, which is not available now. It gets described by different people at different times in slightly different ways. But the more plausible theory is there's one cavern, which has gone missing, as opposed to, no, the military's hiding multiple caverns in Torpedo Yard. So, once again, something which is plausible, he can't help but pick at the evidence to make it look bigger and grander.
Well, that's my chapter 9. Shall we move on to my chapter 10?
Yes, which we kind of covered last week with my chapter 9.
Yes, I was going to say.
It's the same title, the additional evidence. I just had additional evidence in mind.
Yes, so my chapter 10 is the same story we talked about last week, where Mr. Butler was looking for another possible tunnel entrance, which was the observation post that would have been there back when they had the plan to string mines across the Waitemata Harbour. He works out where it is. He talks to the owners of the property, where he thinks it should be, and they say that yes, there was, when they were looking to build on it, they did find a concrete structure that they thought was a water tank, and it's since been destroyed. Now, it didn't have, when you talked about this last time, there was some comment around the fact that they had actually spoken to Doc or someone like that who said, no, it's fine, you can destroy it. Whereas in the first edition, he simply says it had been destroyed. So I guess he didn't have that angle on it at that point.
Yeah, I mean, he may not have known about the communication between the Department of Conservation, or knew there was communication with the Department of Conservation, but didn't have the full details, because as you'll recall, when I discussed that in the last episode, he doesn't mention Dave Vert's name. He simply says the chief archaeologist, who I believe at the time was Dave Vert.
So that certainly makes it sound a little more conspiratorial when you have that extra little nugget to go with it. But then, yes, he talks a bit more about the carpenter's shop. Supposedly, radar scans showed a space behind the carpenter's shop, but no one's ever looked into it. But he leaves that there because he's going to be talking about radar scans later. The main impression I got from this chapter and the one before it is that, if you recall, at the end, when he finished talking about the investigation and Judge Elias's ruling and everything, he said he had at the time, quote, unquantifiable misgivings about the Doc investigation, which to me basically read like, well, it didn't come up with the answers I wanted, so therefore there must be something wrong with it. But he couldn't put his finger on it. But by the end of this one, he seems to have managed to put his finger on what he thinks was wrong about the Doc investigation, and it seems to be largely that they didn't look around Torpedo Yard and around the carpenter's shop, which he seems to think is the best spot to find the entrance to a hidden tunnel. Now, does your book have a chapter called The Conspiracy?
My book has a chapter called A cover-up, question mark?
Yes. Because my next chapter is called The Conspiracy. So you talk about your one. I'm interested to see. I suspect they're going to overlap at this point.
Well, yeah,
'Cause
because my next chapter is the conspiracy, but first we get a cover-up, then a conspiracy.
right. Well, so you give me the cover up, and then I'll look at the conspiracy.
Well, we'll both look at the conspiracy together. Let's not leave me out of the conspiracy, Josh. I mean, I wrote an entire degree on these things. So yeah, chapter 12 in the second and third edition is called a cover up question mark, which you'd know from a New Zealand accent because we just went a cover up, but also we'd simply say a cover up with an exclamation mark in the same way. So frankly, it's very confusing. So this is a case of Butler going, look, there are lots of credible witnesses who say that there are additional tunnels under North Head, and some of those witnesses were serving personnel on North Head during the time it was under military control, and also serving personnel at the time it was transitioning to becoming a park in the public domain. And this is, I mean, we've kind of talked about this in previous episodes, but there is this interesting hypothesis here, which is how does Butler judge someone to be a credible witness? Certainly, he thinks that great men, in quotation marks, must be credible witnesses because they're famous, and besmirching their character must be a bad idea, as we see with Leonard Izzet, Richard Bolt, etc., etc. And also, it seems fairly clear that Butler judges someone to be a credible witness when they agree with him. So when they are the kind of person who puts forward testimony that there is a hidden tunnel complex under North Head, he takes them to be credible. And that's why I think he includes the two old dares who go on the pensioners' trip to North Head and see a massive tunnel complex within it, because he does take them to be credible witnesses, despite the fact that if we take their story seriously, then the conspiracy was blown wide open sometime in the late 1980s because multiple groups of pensioners were being shown through a hidden tunnel complex. Although now I'm thinking about it, that's the perfect way to keep the secret. Show it to old people who are going to die. Who's going to believe them?
No one's going to listen to them anyway.
Last weekend, I was taken through a hidden tunnel complex inside of
Yes, Grandma. Yes, we've all heard your story about the tunnels. Oh, God, Grandma's on about the tunnels again. Somebody get a medicine. Jesus Christ.
And then when the unicorn looked at me, it made me feel special inside.
And so on.
Yeah. Yeah. So there is something weird here about who's taken to be a credible witness versus who is not taken to be a credible witness. And I have to say, applause to us both for that wonderful Shakespearean piece.
It's quite the tableau we constructed there.
Quite extemporaneously. Yeah. Now, a big feature of this chapter is Butler talking about how the army got in the way of John Earnshaw's initial investigation into locating supposed structures within North Head. And I'm sympathetic to the idea the army did get in the way of the Earnshaw investigation. But there's a question here as to whether they got in the way because they were engaging in a cover-up, or they got in the way because they didn't really like the imposition of a civilian coming onto their land and telling them what to do. So a kind of a balance of power situation thing is how dare the civilian tell us what to do, which is kind of reflected by the fact that Earnshaw arrives and the military just do what they want to do because they're in charge. And of course, the other option is they were obliged to do it because they were told by the Crown, you've got to help this person with their investigation. And so the military just do as little as possible. So there are three options here. There's the cover-up hypothesis, which Butler is enamored with. There's the balance of power situation where you've got conflicting authority. And then there's simply we've been told to do something we don't really see the point of, so we're just going to do as little as possible to and to enact it. But Butler is very squarely in the camp that there was deliberate obstruction, and that deliberate obstruction was the purpose of cover up. To quote, and this is where he's talking about one of his eyewitnesses. Being in charge of the Naval Training School at the summit of North Head, Steve Ebre was in an ideal position to state what was going on behind the scenes during the 1988 military investigation. His evidence, which is that there was something untoward going on with the erection of the barbed wire and the abandonment of the Earnshaw investigation after the appearance of the secret witness, indicates that the military high command knew that tunnels would be found if the 1988 investigation continued. The up-to-the-minute monitoring of Earnshaw's investigation by senior officers implies that it was deliberately stage-managed to ensure tunnel entry did not occur.
Yes, so that's quite explicitly conspiratorial, I suppose.
Now, have we talked about the secret witness? I think it got mentioned
It got
briefly.
mentioned that was actually that. I think I noted it later on in a later chapter. The secret witness was mentioned to begin with. That during the Earnshaw investigation on like day 9 of 10,
the last day before they abandoned the investigation, a secret witness comes forward that Earnshaw's not allowed to communicate with.
Yeah, and then following what they saw, the investigation gets shut down a day later. And I always thought it was weird that they sort of drop it there, and then I'm sure the secret witness is mentioned a bit later on. And Butler never really seems to look into that at all as to who the secret witness might have been or anything about them.
Well, there are two possibilities here. Either he knows who the secret witness is, but is obliged to keep that witness secret in order to be able to publish a book. So there might be a situation where identifies who the witness is, but there is actually some rationale for the secrecy. Or B, has never been able to find out who the secret witness is. Now, my suspicion here, given that there's some discussion here about the GCSB, the Government Communication Security Bureau, and the fact that they had some kind of installation or role on North Head, that the secret witness is actually a spook of some kind who came and went, look, you can't poke around here because we're doing intelligence work here, and if you dig through cables or something, that's going to be very, very bad, so stop now. So my suspicion is the secret witness is not a witness to do with hidden tunnels or knowing anything about Boeing seaplanes, but actually being a member of the security services going, look, you can't say anything about this, but there's security stuff going on here, so please stop now. But yes, the secret witness is a really big thing here. The other thing which Butler is concerned with is the weird relationship between Paul Titchener and Lieutenant Commander Dennerly during the terms and times of the Earnshaw investigation. We talked about Paul Titchener briefly in a previous episode, did we not?
Yes, he was the historian who produced a report for them prior to one of the investigations, who seemed to in fact, I'm pretty sure he claimed to have gone into tunnels. He seemed to
he's the person who writes the article in the North Shore Times Advertiser that strongly implies that he and another person went into a tunnel, and then that's called into question because the eyewitness statement seems to predate Titchener, and Titchener eventually recants his tunnel hypothesis.
He eventually changes sides.
Pro the hidden tunnel complex to go, no, actually, it probably isn't true. Now, I vaguely knew Paul Titchener as a child because my mother worked at the bookstore that he ran in Devonport. So he was a local character and local historian in the sense of he was an amateur historian who was writing stuff about the borough of Devonport as it was at the time. And there does seem to be communication between Titchener and Dennerly, which Butler and Earnshaw took to be evidence of some kind of collusion or something going on behind the scenes. My suspicion, and it is just a suspicion, I'm speculating here, is that Dennerley, being resident in Devonport, and Paul Titchener being a local celebrity there, I think he was mayor at one point, it kind of makes sense that the commander of a military installation in Devonport might be talking to the person who's taken to be the local historian, going, well, look, there's all this stuff going on here. What do you think about it? But Butler and Earnshaw quite clearly think that this relationship was inappropriate, and that in some respects, this either led to Dennerley being obstructive, or Dennerley was obstructive from the outset and then communicating the reasons for that obstruction to Titchener, but not to Earnshaw. That being said, there is something curious here. Butler claims, and it would be great to get verification of this, that some of the files around the Earnshaw investigation will remain under lock and key until 2054. Now, I don't know how time works, but I think that's 29 years away.
It is, and if this is stuff from 1984, that's what, 70 years?
Yeah, which I think is kind of standard for official secret stuff. Now, that's interesting. It doesn't necessarily represent a cover-up. Once again, you'd need to actually look at other secrecy clauses around things the military have asked for other types of investigations, see whether this is unusual or usual. But it's still, it is interesting that some of the details about the Earnshaw investigation will be available to us in our late 70s, and probably at a time where Martin Butler will be dead. So you can see that being very frustrating for an investigator, going, well, I'm never going to see these particular files unless I can petition someone in the government to be able to release these things. He's also really fixated on a line that comes out of the Parks Board, who are the people who were responsible for looking after North Head when it initially became a public park. The Parks Board doesn't exist anymore, but it was a feature back in the 1980s. And they're talking about the North Head structures, and they talk about how tunnels apparently exist. And Butler reads that as the park board admitting the tunnels do exist. I read it as a reaction to the claims of Earnshaw. Earnshaw at that time is making the claim there are hidden tunnels under North Head, a place that the Parks Board is about to take responsibility for. The Parks Board makes a response about this, about the apparent existence of those tunnels. Obviously, in relationship to someone who's making claims, there are more structures inside North Head than are publicly available. Butler reads that line as being an admittance by the park boards that the tunnels do exist, which seems like a fairly weird reading of the word apparently, but it's yet another case of him very selectively reading things to find evidence that supports his particular hypothesis.
Yeah, he doesn't have a great opinion, I think, of a lot of these official sources, I guess. But
or any official source that doesn't agree with him, he has a low opinion of.
Mm.
He also makes a really big deal out of the fact that the government seems to have made its mind up about the existence of hidden tunnels, because he writes to the Ministry of Defence. And obviously their mind was set, despite the fact they say they would take 6 weeks to research his claims, which to my mind, I mean, maybe you might think 6 weeks isn't particularly long, but the fact they don't write back immediately saying, no, you're full of extraneous fecal matter, indicates they at least went, oh, we will have a look at this. So he takes it that people have made their mind up. And once again, it's because the reaction he gets 6 weeks later is that they don't support his particular hypothesis. He also has this weird thing where he thinks it's ridiculous that the Department of Conservation wouldn't spend 8.4% of their allocated budget for the Auckland region in 1 year to do just a little bit of ground radar surveying. It's only 8.4% of the allocated budget for a year. And to my mind, if you spend 8.4% of your budget on something which you've already investigated a decade or more prior, I would need to see some justification for that almost 10% of the Auckland budget for 1 year going into doing ground radar surveying of North Head. And I think this points to the other issue, and I've talked to Martin Butler about this. To Butler, the North Head case is a super important, necessary, ongoing investigation that needs constant pressure upon local council and government to get things done properly. To the local council, to the Department of Conservation, and to the government, these investigations were done in the 80s and 90s, and they've yet to see any evidence that's going to swing the needle away from, we think we've done enough now. Butler says, oh, but you only need to spend 8.4% of your annual budget doing this investigation to assure me you're correct. And the Department of Conservation is simply going, yeah, but we've done enough. There's no new evidence here. We've done enough.
Yes, we've done it. We've satisfied ourselves. It isn't really our job to satisfy you.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is not a dispassionate history. I can understand his passion. He really does think, as we're going to see with the ammunition theory, that there is serious danger to the people walking around North Head and living in its surrounds. But at the same time, as far as I can see, none of this evidence he's presenting now is in any way decisive, such that it overrides the fact that we've had a fairly good investigation in the past that indicates there's not much, if anything, to the claim of there being missing or even hidden tunnels under North Head. Actually, I should say missing or even, hidden or even missing tunnels within or under North Head.
Yes, so this is starting to sound like it overlaps with the next chapter of mine, because he starts talking about chemical weapons and stuff.
He does. We might as well move on to the actual conspiracy itself. Chapter 11, The Conspiracy.
Right. So yes, this was my chapter 11, and obviously, so I said he appeared to have got explicitly conspiratorial before, but now he really starts spelling it out. So he reprints the statement of who was Doug Patterson? That's a name I know, but he doesn't. I don't know if he says exactly who this person was, but he.
Hold on. Actually, this is the point where you're going, I should check that as well.
Yes.
Now, the question is, no, Doug Patterson was one of the people who worked for Flying School.
Right, that's right. Doug Patterson.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, CEO of the National Airways Corporation in 1978. He and George Bolt had investigated the disappearance of the Boeing aircraft over a number of years. Here is his account of their investigations.
Right, so that's who. So Doug Patterson. But the point is, he talked to, at the time, Minister of Defence Bob Tizard about these tunnels. Now, according to Doug Patterson, Bob Tizard said that he had spoken to Defence Department officials who said that any planes had been destroyed, but work investigating the existence of tunnels was stopped when they detected unstable ammunition. So I think this is really where the conspiracy theory starts to pivot. I mean, he started talking, all he wanted was to find out where these planes might be, but when he gets into the idea that there may have been some sort of a cover-up, and when he starts looking at why there might have been some sort of a cover-up, the planes get shunted to the side, and it really starts to become all about all this ammunition. This is why the military was and the government was motivated to cover up the existence of these tunnels. It's because of this unstable ammunition. Now, at the time, I thought, hang on, wasn't Bob Tizard the guy who said that Norm Kirk was assassinated by the CIA? Should we be listening to him? But then I went back and checked over our notes, and no, it was Bob Harvey said that Norm Kirk had been assassinated by the CIA, and Bob Tizard was the guy who said that Bob Harvey was full of crap. So he doesn't have a record of conspiracizing there, I suppose. But so having made this claim, Butler says that Doug Patterson says that Bob Tizard says that the Department of Defence said that there were tunnels with ammunition under North Head. He also reprints a North Shore Times article from that period, which makes the same claims.
Now, does your version of the book have the conversation between Tizard and Earnshaw?
No, I don't recall that.
All right. So this is probably relevant here. So not only does he talk about the Earnshaw thing, there's a phone recording between Tizard and Earnshaw where relevant parts of the recording are printed here. So let me read out that discussion. I won't do voices. I'll simply do Bob Tizard speaking. Now John Earnshaw. Bob Tizard. He, here he's referring to Lieutenant General John Mace, was chief, and I made the inquiry to him, as is the appropriate procedure, and he came back to me with the results of the inquiry as he had them. John Earnshaw. He, once again referring to Lieutenant General John Mace, was quite specific about the ammunition, or for some reason, Butler has put after ammo in square brackets ammunition, as if we're not going to know what ammo is. So was quite specific about the ammo. We know it's there from all the people that have Bob Tizard interrupts. I don't think there's any argument about the deteriorating ammunition. Earnshaw responds with, yeah. Bob Tizard continues, that's why the place was sealed initially. They had the choice of methods of disposal, and they took the cheapest, and they just sealed the tunnels. John Earnshaw replies with, yeah, it is, as you say, in quite a hairy condition. And, of course, as you know, ammo. And once again, Butler puts in square brackets ammunition, because we've changed pages now. So maybe you've lost track of what ammo refers to. As you know, ammo just doesn't go away. It becomes even more unstable. Bob Tizard, yes. Bob Tizard then continues, and this is obviously where there's an edit point in the recording, because it goes Bob Tizard, yes. Next line, Bob Tizard. Well, the decision going back earlier than 1980 seems to have been that it was dangerous to shift at the time. The conversation continues with John Earnshaw saying, all he did, and this is referring to someone called Dennis McLean, was sign the agreement on behalf of the Crown for the Army to continue this investigation, which I provided him with aerial pictures of some of the entrances, and of course was quite obvious at the time they were not intending to do this. Bob Tizard says, well, I think they take the attitude that it is exposing members of the armed services to unnecessary risk if they make a physical investigation further. Now I certainly would not order that. They gave me what I thought was a valid opinion that this stuff was dangerous. If disturbed, that's it.
Interesting. So that's even more detail than I got in my one. Now, I have to admit, I kind of tapped out of this chapter eventually. I found in the first edition, this chapter was not really very well organized. It was just a collection of points, one after the other, of here's a weird thing I found out, or here's a suspicious thing I found out. And I just couldn't follow a thread of it. But he talks about all sorts of things. He talks about, he brings up what's an interesting point, that all of these eyewitness accounts now, Judge Elias did, one of the things that she thought counted against them was the fact that they were all at least 30 years old at the time. They all sort of from the 70s or earlier. Butler points out, though, that that's kind of what you'd expect if the tunnels had been hidden in the 1970s, wouldn't you? If that's when they'd hid it, then you'd stop getting eyewitness accounts. If people were just making stuff up, there's no reason why they would have stopped making stuff up or stopped misremembering things after a certain point in time. So he takes the fact that there's sort of a point at which these eyewitness accounts seem to dry up as actually evidence in their favour, which I thought was an interesting argument, although, again, doesn't actually prove anything. He gets more witness statements. Another one, I don't know why this wasn't included earlier in the book, but he has the statement of one Captain Rabbage, who says that in 1980 he saw old plans for North Head that showed tunnels connecting the gun emplacements and an old photograph showing a large entrance with rails going into it at Torpedo Bay. He thought the investigations that were done were very superficial and was quite surprised that they found nothing. He assumed, oh, yes, they're doing these investigations. They'll surely find tunnels, and yet they didn't. He just sort of drops that in there. He talks about the fact that the military did have plans for North Head, even though apparently other investigations had found that they were supposedly destroyed. In this chapter, in this edition, this is where he brings up the fact that that Paul Titchener had this relationship with the with the head of the military there at the time. It also, though, while he's talking about the fact that the military were good buddies with Paul Titchener, it also said that there was correspondence that basically said they had a very poor opinion of Mr. Earnshaw and thought he was a bit of an idiot, which is always something we had suspected when we were talking about this right back at the beginning. Were they acting under orders to cover up the stuff that Mr. Earnshaw wanted investigated, or did they just think he was a bit of an old fool and it wasn't worth their time and effort to investigate his stuff? So again, that point that he brings up, I don't know if it supports his arguments or actually acts against them. He talks about how he went looking for documentation or plans about North Head, but whenever he found stuff, he found it was restricted. And then he brings up the GCSB. So this is the first edition. This is where the Government Communications Security Bureau first shows up. Well, not when they first show up. They were mentioned briefly in, I think, David Vert's one of his reports. And they never really looked into it at the time. But now here in Chapter 11, he points out the fact that the GCSB were there. They were around when the 1988 investigation was going on, the one that John Earnshaw wasn't happy about. And they were apparently using ground radar there. And so Butler's like, okay, so what was the GCSB doing there? He says that he put in an Official Information Act request for information about the investigation and any data they may have gathered, and the response he got back was the GCSB says there isn't any, there is no data from that investigation. We didn't keep any. He then says that apparently there is a Department of Conservation request from 1992 when they were starting this investigation, asking for the same stuff. And the GCSB in that case, rather than saying there isn't any information, they said there is information, but we can't share it for security reasons. And so again, he's sort of darkly hinting at things there. Why is there different? Why is there this difference? These discrepancies? And that was kind of the point where I just lost interest in the whole chapter, to be honest. It had jumped from so many times to jump from one disconnected point to another that I was like, what the hell is going on here? Skip to the end, which is what I did. But perhaps I shouldn't have, because I did notice that as I went through, he then started talking about the idea that there were chemical weapons, in particular mustard gas, stored alongside this unexploded ammunition. So you had more to say about the chemical weapons?
Well, actually, I want to go back to the Tizard stuff and then let's move on to the chemical weapon stuff. So a lot hinges in the version of the chapter in the second and third edition about the Bob Tizard letter, which you talked about, and the conversation between John Earnshaw and Bob Tizard, where it seems to be quite clear Bob Tizard, who was Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defence, has been advised by the military that there are not only sealed up tunnels on North Head or in North Head, but these tunnels contain ammunition. Now, Butler also has to square a circle here, because it's quite clear that if Tizard believed this, nothing was done about it. And he was Deputy Prime Minister and was Minister of Defence. So he does admit that maybe successive governments didn't think much of Tizard's claims, which raises a few questions. One, is Tizard accurately reporting what he heard from the military? So maybe Tizard was told something and then misinterprets it in such a way that it ends up agreeing with Earnshaw, and thus they have this conversation. But after the fact, when actually Tizard goes back to his notes or checks with officials, finds that actually they didn't quite say what he thought they said, which would explain why governments have done nothing subsequently. Or is it the case that, as we kind of intimated before, other members of the Labour Party, because Tizard was a Labour Deputy Prime Minister, didn't really think much of Tizard as an intellect? He was considered to be a bit of a fool, and thus maybe he misinterpreted something which was said in jest as being a serious thing. But a lot of this chapter is hinged upon the fact that Tizard makes this claim, and therefore it is a claim that must be taken seriously because it is the claim of a government minister. And on one level, that seems right. If a government minister tells a private citizen there are sealed tunnels on or in North Head that contain decaying ammunition, that's in theory a very credible source, especially when they're not just Deputy Prime Minister, they are the Minister of Defence. They should know about these things. The only thing which mitigates the taking this source seriously is that no subsequent Minister of Defence has taken the Tizard claim seriously, including Ministers of Defence who had heard the recording. And as we're going to find out in a latter part of the second and third edition of the book, this recording is played to another Minister of Defence who doesn't seem to take much note of it at all. Although, of course, that could be it's all been covered up.
Well, yes. Yeah, I mean, everything here can be explained, I guess, either by cover-up or by something a little more prosaic. But
you want to know about that mustard gas?
Yeah, I was going to say, the hell with prosaic. Tell me about mustard gas.
So, Aotearoa, New Zealand had mustard gas during the Second World War. In fact, actually, this is an interesting aspect of going to the University of Auckland. You know where AUSA House is at the University of Auckland?
Oh, vaguely.
I mean, you used to literally deliver your cartoons to the Crackham offices there.
Yeah.
So yes, you know where AUSA. Josh used to be a cartoonist. He's actually had several different careers as cartoonists over the years, but we won't get into that now. So where AUSA House is also where the Kate Edgar Commons was built. Now, what most students at the University of Auckland don't know is that that particular complex on the University of Auckland was at one stage occupied as barracks and a kind of general location for US soldiers when they were stationed in Auckland during World War II. And they were keeping chemical weapons in the basement there at one point, or at least that is what is assumed. So when they dug out the area to build the Kate Edgar Commons, they had to do soil testing to make sure that whatever had been stored there during World War II hadn't leached into the soil, because otherwise people were going to die. So we did have mustard gas, and this is a bit of a problem here. The amount of mustard gas that we disposed of by basically putting it out to sea after World War II doesn't match the amount that we claimed we had. So there's a discrepancy here where not enough was disposed of versus the amount that we had at the time. Now, some people think this is because there's an accounting error with the amount we had. So it turns out we overcounted the amount of mustard gas we had, and we disposed of all of it at the end of World War II. Other people are going, well, no, there is an accounting error here, and we had some of it, and some of it has gone missing. We don't know where it is. And so Butler has this theory here that what if the missing mustard gas was put into that ammunition depot that I postulated existed within the bowels of North Head? That would be a really good rationale to make sure that nobody gets in, because the mustard gas would have been stored in containers. Those containers will have now degraded. So not only have you got to worry here about explosives in the hill that might go up if you hit them too hard, but if you open the chambers, what if there's a whole bunch of mustard gas there that kills you? Food for thought.
It is. So, but yes, by that point my eyes had glazed over a little bit, and I just skipped to the end, because at the end of chapter 11 he does sort of lay everything out where he's at in his thinking at this time. He thinks that the investigations into North Head all had what he calls shortfalls and flaws, and he puts forward this scenario that the military, either deliberately or by mistake, left ammunition stored underneath North Head, that in the late 1970s they decided they needed to cover this up. His theory is that first investigation back in 1980 gained access to these tunnels and verified the presence of this ammunition, and Bob Tizard was told about it. And this meant that the 1988 investigation done with John Earnshaw was always intended to find nothing. So he's going full cover up there. He appeals to the various statements of evidence he had presented in that chapter to show that. He lists a bunch of things that he thinks the Doc investigation got wrong, and the fact that they stuck to their findings of, as he puts it, no tunnels, no aeroplanes, and no ammunition under North Head makes him worry that the Department of Conservation had, he suggests darkly, another agenda.
Dun, dun, dun. Oh, actually, hold on. And also,
yeah, fair enough. So he says, the way forward is therefore evident. Finding just one tunnel may lead to another tunnel, and in turn to the ultimate reason why I started this whole tortuous process, to find out what happened to the first Boeing aircraft ever made. Only now, this objective has become secondary to ensuring that there is nothing more sinister lurking inside North Head. So he's really sort of pivoted to the ammunition side of things over the aeroplane side of things at this point.
So, Josh, I think we have to go for an episode 4. I think we've prevaricated so much that there's still 4 more chapter or chapterettes to go. I think it's going to be a 4-episode saga, no matter what twist I might have at the end.
Well, all I can say is there's a pair of fish coming your way the next time you're in New Zealand.
Right, but Josh, this is partially of your own design. If you're going to slap me with a fish, I think you need to slap yourself with a fish at the same time. It needs to be the rare double self-slap.
Well, yes, I don't know. Maybe we just need to take fewer notes when we do this sort of thing. But yes, no, you're right. We've been at this for quite a while, and there's still more to go. Because basically, so where we're at, he's going to do his own ground radar survey. He's going to talk about that a bit. Then he's going to sum everything up. And that's where it pretty much ends for me, but then you've got a bunch of extra stuff.
Yeah,
to
because my versions of the book are
that.
post the ground radar survey. So it's talking about what was found beneath the ground. And then the book ends with a series of updates saying, look, I found all these things. Nobody seems to be taking what I've found particularly seriously. What's going on there? So, yeah, you're going to we're going to see you go, oh, there's going to be a ground radar survey. And I'm going, Josh, that happened 10 years ago. It happened 10 years ago.
Yes, okay, well then, fine, because we both have lives to live, and we have to go off and record a bonus episode for our patrons. We'd best call things a day for now. But that bonus episode, we've got a couple of updates on older stories, and then we thought maybe we could do not a deep dive, but a look. Take a look at an old case which was mentioned in the news recently, and which old timers like us remember from at the time, but which the more youthful and vibrant of our audience might not recall at all.
That's true, because I have not heard the name Menendez in a long time.
No, well, it's because you didn't watch the new show on Netflix. But anyway, so we're going to talk about a bunch of that sort of stuff. And if you want to listen to us talk about a bunch of that sort of stuff, you need to be a patron. And if you're a patron, then but both your work and our work here is done. If you're not a patron, just go to patreon.com and look for the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy.
Because if you're not a patron, then your work has yet to commence.
No, you still have important things left in your life. So, I think I guess we're done. We're putting a line in it.
For the time being. But the other thing, so this happened the last episode as well. There was a hiccup in the first 20 minutes of the recording. So if Josh sounds particularly disinterested in anything I'm saying, it's because we actually lost the first 20 minutes of the recording. We think we've recovered it, but we actually won't know until such time we actually press stop on this recording and look at the recording. So the first 20 minutes may be me talking away and Josh putting in sound bites of, aha, Yes, that is interesting. No, you are right. That does prove the point. Yes, I am insane.
Yes, and so on and so forth. But until such time as we stop recording and start the grueling editing process, it is time for me to come up with another catchphrase to go out on. And I had a good one earlier this week, and I've lost it completely. I swear it was a real pearler. It would have turned this podcast around, but it was not to be. So instead, I'm just going to say, make mine conspiracy.
And I'm off to grill a gorilla.
That's just awful. I can't even... what the hell was the old one? It was good. It was genuinely good. And it's gone. It'll never come back.
Yeah, well, might bring it back. Good old fish slap to the face.
Yep. Oh, well. I'll see you in June.
No, August.
August. Same thing.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy features Josh Addison and Associate Professor M.R.X. Dentith. Our producers are a mysterious cabal of conspirators known as Tom, Philip, and another who is so mysterious that they remain anonymous. You can contact us electronically via podcastconspiracy@gmail.com or join our Patreon and get access to our Discord server. Or don't, I'm not your mum. And remember, bees.